I'm Deb Fisher, the Secretary of the Siegfried Sassoon Fellowship, and hopefully this is the first in a series of recordings we're going to do for our members during lockdown. And today we have one of our patrons, the multi-talented Neil Brand, who most people will know you, Neil, as a broadcaster from your, is it 4 or 5 series that you've done on BBC4?
Now 5, yes, amazingly.
5 very successful series that you've presented on BBC4. But a lot of people may not be aware of your other skills, your pianist, composer, actor and award-winning playwright. So the last time I saw you in the flesh, as it were, was in London at the Reform Club, where we had a committee meeting a couple of years back. And very historic setting, obviously. We sat in a room where Asquith used to sometimes hold his cabinet meetings. In the kind of period, really, that we are dealing with. I
think you can't help but be affected by the atmosphere in that place. It wears its history right on its surface, and even as you walk in, the sort of palpable sense that you're surrounded by people who are doing pretty much what the members would have been doing for so many years, and of course as a sort of political entity as well.
Yes.
I've always found it interesting that Sassoon sort of didn't see himself as clubbable. He wasn't someone who could just walk into a room and basically work the room, and yet was so at home at the Reform. And I guess it was probably his only real social outlet for many years in the early 20s, when he was virtually reclusive. And it's very interesting to imagine him walking in through those doors, scanning faces to see if there was anybody he actually knew, or anybody who he was going to be meeting with, or if indeed he ever would have gone just on spec, or if he would only have gone when he knew he was going to be meeting with someone for lunch or for dinner. Yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, I think you're probably right. I mean, it was almost something, I feel that it was almost something he aspired to rather than something he really wanted. But, I've just been reading about someone we're going to possibly talk about in a moment. T.E. Lawrence, who of course was a great friend of Sassoon's. And when Lawrence had, after his moment of fame, when he wanted to retreat into anonymity, he joined the RAF as an ordinary aircraftman under an assumed name, and allegedly he used to hang around in Pall Mall, hoping to see some friend or other of his passing on the way to one of the gentlemen's clubs for lunch, in the hope that he could get a free lunch out of them, because he didn't have any money. I don't
that wouldn't surprise me at all.
It could be, it's possibly true. So yes. So since we met in the Reform Club, of course, we've had COVID and the lockdown, and life has been very difficult for a lot of people. And you've had COVID yourself, haven't you?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
I was very lucky, really, because the one thing it didn't attack on me was my lungs. I've had asthma all my life, and I'm also have a couple of the other issues that they say people should be careful of with COVID. So I felt pretty lucky. It knocked me out for about 8 or 9 days, and I'm still coming out of it, but I'm luckier than most, that's for sure.
Yeah, I guess so. And times were already pretty hard, I think, because they're very hard for creative people at the moment. I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to. This past year has been quite hard. I run a company that represents both me and my wife, and obviously the work that I do is fairly diverse. So I have at least been able to keep something coming into the coffers over the year. But all of her work was live in somewhere or other, either in schools with education projects, or for book companies, she would be presenting new releases at book festivals through the years. All of that went. So she actually had absolutely nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're company directors, we couldn't get freelance help either. So we've been in a pretty tight time from that point of view, and reliant on friends and reliant on whatever work we could get. But I'm hoping that I've managed to land a project for the next 2 or 3 months, a writing stroke composing project, which would actually be for a private commission, which will help us enormously, but we shall see.
People, I think, tend to assume that if they see someone on television, that person must be extremely wealthy.
Well,
but the first book I wrote, which is a tiny little thing that, you know, probably printed 1,000 copies or something, and it just happened that around about the same time or shortly afterwards, I moved house. One of my friends thought that I was buying a new house with the money I'd made from the book. I never made anything out of it. It cost me more to travel to see the publisher than than I got back from the book. Anyway,
being absolutely straight about it, TV, and particularly the TV that I do, and indeed all the work that I do, I get paid very well for doing it, but I don't get any royalties. So I was interested to see that Sound of Musicals, which I made 4 years ago, is being repeated again as of this Friday. And I think I may be heading for being as ubiquitous as Dad's Army eventually, because they've got all my stuff stacked up. Yes. There's now 15 hours of telly which they've bought, so they can just keep drip feeding it through there.
This means it's popular, though. I mean, people must want to see it for them to take the trouble.
It's it's very, very. And I listen. I'm not complaining, but your point about, you know, I'm not Simon Sharma, and so, you know, there's only so much money to be had out of these things, and each one also you tend to spend months planning before they actually get bought. So the last one, the TV, Sound of TV, it took a year to actually get it away with the BBC.
Yeah, with all the things that are happening. Yeah. I wonder if we could start, if you could just briefly sort of recount how you got started on this very unlucrative career path.
Yes, my specialties have been playing the piano for silent film, writing radio dramas, and making TV programs that are bought out. So my entire career has been at what one might call the rather sort of specialist end of the market. It's a curious one, really, because when people sort of say to me, well, how on earth did you end up here? It is absolutely unplanned. I could no more have planned out this career than I could have flown to the moon. The bottom line of it was that when I was very young, I was lucky enough to have the ability to hear music and then sit down and work it out at the piano. And after a while, that ability to play by ear far outstripped any ability I had to read music. And although you might find it hard to believe, I took piano lessons till I was about 16 and then gave them up after I'd taken my grade 5. Got very interested in drama and went to university to study drama at Aberystwyth, and I studied a drama joint degree of English and drama. Came out of that having actually practiced a lot of music with the drama, and I was writing music for the shows. I was MDing, even though my sight reading was dreadful. With all the gall of youth, I was musical director for 3 summer seasons in Aberystwyth, which the drama department did, especially for children. And in fact, the first piece of music I ever wrote, which was for Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, which they did at the Theatre at Casteth in 1980, I've just re-recorded, and it's gone out on an album you can find of mine on Spotify called Piano Dreams. And it's lovely to be digging up a piece that I wrote 40 years ago. Where I really lucked out, and where I really couldn't have planned any of this, was that I was invited to play the piano for a silent film by Eastbourne Film Society. I was one of a group of students from Aberystwyth who'd reopened an old cinema in Eastbourne, which we ran as an arts centre. And the local film society wanted to show films there. It was great because the projection was all there, the screen was there. It was very easy to do. And they said, look, we know you play the piano. Would you be interested in having a go at Buster Keaton? And from that one performance, in which I'd only sort of prepared about 15 minutes of music in my head and hoped something would take over. I mean, I had played for an hour just improvising, but only at home, only sort of for myself. And an extraordinary thing happened with the film, which was that the action of the film, and more particularly the response of the audience, inspired me completely. So the first time there was a big laugh, and of course, with Buster Keaton, Steamboat Bill Jr., the first laugh is within the first 5 minutes of the film. All the music that I planned went right out of my head. And there was something else there that I was playing. It was a little bit like automatic writing in a way. It just felt like my response to what was happening on screen and what it was doing to the audience was coming out of my fingers as music. And at the end of that show, I thought, right, that's it. That this is my ho ho, my career path. It took me 10 years to establish any kind of reliable career from that. But what I did get within a couple of years was an audition to play at the National Film Theatre in London. And that was the one place in the country where they were doing silent films on a very regular basis. So I found myself at the NFT playing for movies from all over the world, playing them all at sight. So these were all films I didn't see beforehand. They would start to unreel and I would start to play. And I would make up my mind as the film was going on, what the music should do and where it should go next. And I also began to find that every performance was an audition, because there were almost always people in the audience who would come up afterwards and say, I thought that was great, which is very nice anyway. I make radio programs, or I'm planning this advert or whatever. Would you like to pitch to do some music for it? So slowly out of that came more and more opportunities. I was invited to play at a foreign festival in Italy for the first time. It's a silent movie festival in a place called Pordenone near Venice. And I was the first Brit to play there. I was actually the first non-Italian to play for their festival. And suddenly the whole world of silent film opened up. I was playing The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, very famous German expressionist film. And from that, I had people coming from the States. I had people from Germany, people from France, people from Italy, inviting me to play for them. So there really was, by that time, some momentum behind a career in playing for silent films. And it was still quite difficult to explain to people at parties what I did,
yes,
because it was still a very obscure job. This is pre the Croydon trams, but I might as well have said I was a tram driver, for any use that that job might actually have had.
So did your musical playing the music for the films, did this sort of music come before your interest in silent films, or was it the other way around?
No, it really did. I felt once I was established playing regularly for the films, I had to learn about the genre and about the repertoire, because even for a repertoire that only runs from 1895 to 1928-29, even there you have a vast history of styles, of filmmaking approaches, of design, of stars and characters, of production studios, and all of that fed into how I then played the films. And it became pretty obvious that each film that I played, initially there was one chap at the NFT who was the silent movie man, and he'd be waiting in the foyer when I arrived, and he'd say, deal, yes, good, well, this one is and I'd get a little bit of like one line of what the film was going to be like, and then I'd go in and play it. Well, once you start playing festivals and things like that, you get an entire program note on a film, where it's come from, who was behind it, why it's so important. And because, again, playing festivals, I was playing the cream of the movies that still existed. Now, it's an interesting one, because, I think a lot of people know that 2/3 of silent film has disappeared forever, simply because it was utterly unvalued once sound came in. But I have to say, I genuinely believe the third that has survived is the best third. I mean, I think we have got the masterpieces. So I would find myself sitting down in front of an utter masterpiece. One of the most extraordinary days of my life was when a movie that had been made in 1918 called The Life and Times of David Lloyd George, which had been missing since 1918, turned up on Lloyd George grandson's farm in individual reels. So not the reels it would have been put together in, but actually the individual reels almost that it was shot in. And the sound archive in Wales at Aberystwyth, the film archive there, painstakingly put it together. And they said, look, will you play the first performance when we play it? And a lot of historic research had been done by a phenomenal man called Dave Berry, who's unfortunately not with us anymore. And the suggestion was that the film was made as a biopic of Lloyd George, probably to be released as a serial, and was extraordinarily good. I mean, phenomenal. Battle scenes, incredible recreations of the riot in Birmingham, where he was smuggled out of Birmingham Town Hall, his own life at number 10, the Munitions Factory. He tours a real munitions factory, so they've done it well. But the suggestion was that literally the night before the trade show, where it was going to be shown to distributors, a car drove up at the production company's offices. A man got out and handed over a suitcase with £25,000 in £1,000 notes and drove off with a negative. And the negative was not seen again until it turned up on Lloyd George's grandson's farm in 1990. So after it had been put together, it was shown for the first time in Pwllheli in front of family members, the descendants of Lloyd George. But obviously shown in Pwllheli because it was very close to Criccieth, because there was still a Lloyd George connection there. And so I played that very first performance, and the sense of historical responsibility of sitting in front of a movie, which particularly one in which there was such an understanding of the war. Of course, in 1918 there would be. Yeah. And the most wonderful final scene, which was called the final parade, where you just see men lining up, and families waiting for them, which must have been shot before November 1918. So it's projecting forward to the future, and to which I just played the last post, and with all of that wonderful harmonic setting that the bands give it when they play the Remembrance Day. It was just astonishing to feel part of the history of that Prime Minister, that film, that period. And that sort of sums up for me the best thing about being a silent film pianist, is you find yourself at the sharp end of a real sense of time travel, that you're back in those days. And your responsibility is both to the filmmakers and the audience of the time and the audience now that are watching.
The first time I actually saw you on television, I mean, I'd met you before, but the first time I actually saw you on television was Leslie Garrett on Who Do You Think You Are? And she said one of her ancestors had been a pianist in cinema, and they called on you to explain to her what his job would have been like.
Yeah. That was fascinating, because she had never really understood where her musical talents came from. She'd known that I think it was her great uncle, because she was from a family from the Yorkshire Pits.
Yes.
And most of her ancestors had been miners.
Yes.
It turned out that this particular chap had a weak chest, so couldn't go down the mine, but had to earn his keep some other way. And they'd found the details. He actually led the band in the cinema. I think I'm right in saying in Rotherham. And that band had played for the films through the week, but then because on Sundays they weren't allowed to show film because it was the day of the Lord, they did concerts, and the concerts were classical music concerts, and the place would be packed to the rafters with people just listening to the band. So they were very high quality. But she remembered.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I was going to say she remembered when sound came in. He just packed his violin away and never played it again, as I've heard a lot of people did. And the worst day for him was when he was walking down the street in Rotherham a year or two later and saw 2 or 3 chaps begging in the street and realized they were members of his old band.
But they,
so that sort of...
The musicians, I suppose, I mean, at first, they not only played music for the films, they played in between the films. I mean, I know this because my great-grandparents ran a couple of cinemas down in South Wales here, and they had these interludes. They didn't only have, in fact, on one occasion, they had Lloyd George to come and speak in the cinema. Now, I assume they weren't showing a film at the same time. I'm not 100% sure. My grandfather was a Liberal voter, and he told me this. So I've always gone around saying my grandfather knew Lloyd George, although he only met him once. But he did say that Lloyd George, what a powerful speaker Lloyd George was, and how he'd come down to this Labour voting constituency and had the audience eating out of his hand very quickly. But they also used to do things in between, like comedy sketches and other kinds of little playlets where with audience participation sometimes. But of course, during the war, it would have been also a recruiting tool, wouldn't it? The cinema that showed the films. And as you see in, there's a scene in Oh, What a Lovely War where Maggie Smith is encouraging them to come up on stage and volunteer.
Absolutely. I first became aware of these at I ended up as a director of the British Silent Film Festival.
Yes.
And there is a fascinating genre of silent films called, and I've got to get this right now, oh gosh, I'll tell you what they are, and then hopefully the name of the genre will come back to me. They are photographs filmed of the men in the locality who have joined up. So these aren't men who've been killed. These are just simply photos of men who have joined up and gone off to fight in the First World War. So all the different cinemas around the country paid probably to the still photographers who'd been taking these photos of men in their uniforms, because of course that was part of the rite of passage, so as to be able to show on the screen these men, which would not only get them an audience from the families who would be there, it would show their patriotic duties, that this was an area that was supplying these men. It's quite possible that where your grandparents, the cinema where they ran, would have done something of that sort.
I think so.
And we have a few of those still survived. You can find them on the BFI website. And there's one particularly from Braintree, Roll of Honour Films. That's it, the Roll of Honour Films. And the Roll of Honour is something that you see in cinemas from about early 1915, really until the really bad numbers come back in again at the beginning of 1916. So they're not the men who have been drafted. They are the men who have volunteered for the colours. And they're they're very moving, because they are simply still photographs going past you of these young men in these ill-fitting uniforms, stiff as a board, because of course they couldn't move in front of the camera, otherwise it would blur. One after the other after the other. And I found I had to try and actually address something about the music, which was, it would have been very easy for me to bring if I may be allowed to use such a term, Sassoonian view to these men that the very fact they joined up was an almost guarantee that they would be killed, or they'd be injured, or that they would go through hell. And I hummed and hawed while I was playing, because I was just working through chords while this was there, because also it's quite hard to play something that's not a narrative.
Yes, yes.
And then I thought, well, actually, what would they have played at the time? So I played I Vow to Thee, My Country. And it was astonishing how the Roll of Honor films suddenly came to life with I Vow to Thee, My Country as the tune underneath them, because it really did match the intention of the filmmakers as to why they were there, and the spirit and the passion of that piece and what it represented for the people at home, particularly, and the cinema goers were the home front of the First World War.
Do you think that they would ever have played popular songs of the period to accompany propaganda films, or would that have been a set?
It's quite possible. It's quite possible. It's very hard to know. The first time a proper score was supplied for a film, ever, and by a proper score I mean a full list of the music that must be played with it, was with Battle of the Somme in 1916. Up until then, bands had been left pretty much to their own devices as to what they played with film. But this film was seen as being so important that the music that was required to go with the film from scene to scene was absolutely there in front of the band leader, and they had to play that. And in fact, the Imperial War Museum has released a very, very good quality print of Battle of the Somme with the original score as it would have been required. However, we do know that in Dublin, when the film was shown, there was an interval during which a one-armed juggler performed. Now, that does sound kind of ludicrous, except I'm assuming this was a soldier with one arm who could juggle with the other. So your point about would they play popular song, would they play, stuff people recognize? Yeah, why not? Because the jump from the sort of intent of something like Battle of the Somme to entertaining an audience like your grandparents did with their little comedy sketches and things like that, it's very short. They still need entertainment at the end of the day. So quite possibly. It is astonishing what was, I was going to say, it's astonishing what was there in the way of entertainment for wartime audiences. There's a wonderful, absolutely bonkers pantomime, which I think was playing in the West End through the war, called The Lads from the Village, which is about two of our lads joining up and getting involved with a German spy who happens to live in a nearby house, and ending up having to go off to the Sultan's harem in Arabia, dressed up in harem gear, in order to save the girl who's missing, and there's a heroic kind of army type goes in as well. It's absolutely, it's carry on up the Casbah, but hugely successful. Very, very much the kind of knockabout that people have loved. It's by our standards, it's only so funny, but by the standards of the time, people loved them. There were serials of, secret agent serials where they're taking on the Germans. All sorts of not just dramas, and certainly not just kind of, tough stuff about the war, but genuine entertainment across all of the genres that cinema was providing during the First World War.
I think Sassoon must have had a somewhat ambivalent view towards the cinema, because he certainly liked going to the cinema, but he didn't really approve of some of the kinds of propaganda that were being put out. And of course, he famously said, "One day I will kill the man who wrote Keep the Home Fires Burning."
Oh, yeah.
But when he actually met Ivor Novello, instead of killing him, he had an affair with him.
I think Ivor was a remarkably attractive man. I think this was, I don't think he had any option. Yeah, but I mean, there is a really bitter poem by Sassoon about the moving pictures.
Yes.
Which he had, and you can tell that this is for him, it's an affront because it cannot represent the genuine experience of the soldier.
Do you mean I'd like to see a tank? I'd like to see a tank come down the stores.
There's another one. I think I may be wrong. I thought there was another one that he called Moving Pictures. But the one about the tank, I think, also plays into your earlier point. There was a follow-up, which people may or may not know about, to the Battle of the Somme, called the Battle of Ancre and the Advance of the Tanks.
Yes.
And here you see the tanks basically being the new wonder weapons that are going to just roll across the German army. Again, full of ironies. It was released, I think, late 1917. So there were going to be it's going to be another year of war before that happened. But I can well imagine that what he saw was the stage show that that played that film. So in other words, they would have had the film of the Battle of Ancre and the Advance of the Tanks, but they would have had showgirls coming on beforehand saying, we bet the Kaiser loves our dear old tanks.
Yes.
And I can't prove it, but I suspect that was what he saw.
That may well
because
be. Yes.
He doesn't strike me as the kind of bloke who would just go along to a cabaret or a kind of high-kicking show, but he might well have gone along to see the Battle of Ancre because it was a very, very big release in its time.
Going on from that, of course, just after the war, it was the cinema really that made Lawrence of Arabia, because Lowell Thomas, am I saying that right? Is it Lowell Thomas or Lowell Thomas?
That's right.
Sure.
Lowell
the
Thomas,
American journalist. I mean, when he showed these films that he'd taken of Lawrence during the war, he had to give a running commentary as well, because it was, it wouldn't be enough to just play music. He had to explain what was going on, and he, I gather, adjusted his commentary to suit the occasion and the audience.
Very much so.
Yes, I don't know
curiously enough,
when it was at Covent Garden and the King and Queen came to see it.
Well, we've got his script, and amazingly, we've got most of the images he showed as well. And a good friend of mine, Luke McKernan, who was for many years a researcher at the BFI, and subsequently now is involved in the British Library and a senior curator there, he put together a show called Lowell Thomas Presents Lawrence of Arabia, and it was it was him and me and a piano, because we couldn't run to Lowell Thomas's budget, at which I read the script that Thomas wrote, and we showed the images and we showed the footage. But I hadn't realized until we were researching that, and Luke filled all this in as part of the show. At the Albert Hall, he had a 3-hour extravaganza, including camels crossing the main part of the auditorium. He had pyramids, he had sand, he had dancers, he had water. Goodness knows how he did all this. He made a massive spectacle along the lines of the sort of Reinhardt operas in Germany later on, where basically he'd taken over an entire space. And as part of that, there he was in his desert gear, giving the speech, saying what the material was while it was being shown on a big screen. And it was only on a massive screen at the Albert Hall. Now, that, I can entirely understand Lawrence wanting to run away like mad from that, because it was as if his wartime career had been the basis for a circus, literally a circus. Interestingly, Luke, who is a man of very strong ethical beliefs, after we'd done that show, he said, I don't think I want to go on with this anymore, because it is a piece of propaganda. Lowell Thomas has basically put a slant on the facts that fit both his narrative, which he wants to give, which is, I was the man who discovered this extraordinary person, and I'm the man bringing you these words, and this is what Lawrence thought, and this is what Lawrence did. And also it fitted the public's need for a hero.
Yes.
At that time, which Lawrence himself could no more have gone along with than he could have flown to the moon, because obviously he did not see what he had done in anything like the same light that Lowell Thomas did.
And it must have got worse as time went on, because of course after the war he was still trying to settle the political situation in the Middle East, or help to settle it, I should say. And you know, it didn't end up as he'd hoped, and he must have been more despairing.
He was betrayed entirely, and betrayed by very, very powerful vested interests, national vested interests, France and Britain.
I was interested that in his little, I'm sure you've been in Cloudshill, his little tiny house in Dorset, that he had not much room for anything, but he managed to find a room for music, you know, for record player, and I think, did he not have a piano? I can't remember now. I think he did.
He may have done. He may have done. I know he was very fond of Scarlatti. He played Scarlatti records a lot. And it's interesting that the statue to him in the church nearby is a massive, larger than life Lawrence sitting in what amounts to an Arabian throne, wearing full Arabian gear. And I do wonder how much he would have even remotely approved of that appearing after his death.
I think he may have seen that as a disguise, you know. He liked dressing in it because people didn't, because it was a bit of a joke with him. He says that when he joined the RAF, he was in the mess. On the wall was a big photograph of him in his Arab robes. And nobody looked at that and looked at him and realized that they were the same person.
There is footage of him, obviously, with Faisal. And he is a remarkably small and nondescript man. Now, that's not in any way to take anything away from him, but I can quite understand that nobody would think this was the extraordinary man who led the attack on Aqaba, who had brought the tribes together, who had been able to impose his will on some of the most buccaneering Arab tribes that existed, you know, who had not actually fought together for hundreds of years. So, yeah, very, very interesting. And how I'd love to have been a fly on the wall when he was talking to Sassoon. What the conversations must have been like. And indeed Hardy. I think I'm right in saying he met him through Hardy. I may be wrong about that, but I think Hardy introduced Sassoon and Lawrence.
Well, actually,
in Dorset.
No, actually, Sassoon met Hardy the day after he met Lawrence.
Ah, okay.
And I hadn't thought it was there, but I spotted it in the when I was reading up on this this evening, that he'd actually said afterwards that he wondered why he hadn't thought of mentioning to Lawrence that first time he met him that he was going to meet Hardy the following day, and it was the first time he'd met either of them. And my theory is that this had something to do with Sassoon forgetting about Wilfred Owen, because it was right at the end of the war, you know, that it was in November, and the fact that he met this extraordinary person who was going to become a great friend, and then the following day he met this person that he'd worshipped since he was a child, that everything else kind of went by the wayside. Anyway, the reason I keep coming back to Lawrence is because, and we haven't really got time to do it now. I think we should save it for another occasion. Lawrence is, of course, a major character, as is Hardy, in your play Between the Lines, in which the main character is Sassoon. And I hope that we'll be able to have a full session of talking about that play another time. Would you like to do that?
Very much indeed. It's entirely down to John Stewart Roberts and his superb life of Sassoon that I happened upon that play. because towards the end of a chapter, he happens to mention that Sassoon was given a car. And my grandfather was killed in the First World War. My mother was a war orphan in a village in Sussex. She never knew her dad. She was born in 1916 and he was killed in September 1917. And so the war has always been very alive in my mind and in my imagination, right from boyhood. And I'd never really written anything about the war that had had any kind of piquancy to it. And I have to say, when that play finally emerged, and it emerged for all sorts of other reasons as well as wanting to write about the war, it did feel like something I'd wanted to write for a very long time, and I'm still extremely proud of it. So yes, I'd love to talk about it if that's something you'd like to do on another occasion.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Neil. I think that in giving us this really interesting insight into the silent cinema, you've sort of more than fulfilled your role as a patron of the Siegfried Sassoon Fellowship. And hopefully I'll be able to figure out how to add some links to this recording, showing, leading on to some of your other online work and to your website. So thank you very much for this, and it's been really enjoyable for me, and I hope for you too.
A real pleasure. Thank you. See you again.
Thank you.